From New York City, one of the epicenters of the pandemic in the United States, this is Democracy Now!
The fact that we now can openly call for the abolition of imprisonment as the existing mode of punishment and the abolition of policing as the major form of security in our worlds. We owe that to people who stood up many decades ago.
As protests against police brutality and racism continue across the globe, we spend the hour with legendary scholar, icon, and activist Angela Davis, author of many books, including Freedom is a Constant Struggle.
So it's our responsibility to do the work that will, and the responsibility of younger people, too, to make sure that you do the work that will keep the ideas alive, that will keep the possibility of freedom alive. Because it's not going to happen tomorrow. We know that. But it can happen. It could happen sometime in the future.
Angela Davis for the hour on the historic protest, calls to defund the police, tearing down of racist statues, what abolition means today, the 2020 race, and much more. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Around the globe, as countries continue to ease up on coronavirus lockdowns and restrictions, the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases has topped 7.5 million, and the death toll has topped 420,000. Coronavirus cases continue to surge in India, with nearly 300,000 confirmed coronavirus cases. India has surpassed Britain as the world's fourth most affected country. India is now behind only the United States, Brazil, and Russia. Public health authorities in India could soon run out of hospital beds. Confirmed coronavirus cases in Latin America have topped 1.5 million. In Brazil, critics of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro's disastrous handling of the COVID-19 pandemic dug 100 graves and placed black crosses in the sand of Rio de Janeiro's Copacabana Beach in a tribute to the more than 40,000 Brazilians who've died of the coronavirus. Brazil has become an epicenter of the pandemic in the global south, with over 802,000 confirmed cases, the world's worst-hit country after the United States. In Guatemala, as confirmed coronavirus cases top 8,500 and over 300 people have died, medical staff warn hospitals are on the brink of collapse. This comes as morgues are also reportedly overflowing. This is Marco Antonio Barrientos, director of one of Guatemala City's hospitals, speaking to reporters Thursday.
The hospital is reaching its limit. We've definitely reached the peak of the situation. We are overflowing with patients. The medical staff is struggling with everything. They are tired. They are exhausted.
Here in the United States, the coronavirus death toll is approaching 114,000, but that's widely viewed to be a vast undercount. In Maryland, the Baltimore Sun reports hundreds of deaths have gone uncounted in nursing homes and other elder care facilities. Many states are reporting a new surge in cases following the reopening of the businesses. In Oregon, officials have paused reopening the state's economy due as the number of daily infections hits a new high. Another 1.5 million U.S. residents filed for state unemployment benefits last week. More than 44 million people have now applied for jobless benefits since mid-March. Meanwhile, the Dow dropped nearly 7% Thursday, in its biggest fall since March, as many states are reporting a surge in coronavirus cases and hospitalizations. In news from Minnesota, CNN is reporting former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin could receive more than $1 million in pension benefits, even if he's convicted of murdering George Floyd. In some states, public employees convicted of felony crimes related to their work lose their pensions, but that's not the case in Minnesota. Meanwhile, Thomas Lane, one of the other officers arrested for the murder of Floyd's killing, has been released on $750,000 bond. All 4 officers are scheduled to be next in court on June 29th. The Minneapolis police chief, Arredondo, has announced the department is withdrawing from contract negotiations with the police union, which has a long history of blocking reform efforts within the department. This comes as calls are growing for Minneapolis Police Federation President Bob Kroll to resign. Kroll has long been accused of holding racist views and for shielding officers accused of abuse. Last week, he described George Floyd as a violent criminal. He once described Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization. In October, Kroll spoke at a Trump rally in Minnesota wearing a Cops for Trump shirt. A warning to our listeners and viewers. The following stories contain graphic images and sounds of police violence. In Austin, Texas, city councilors voted unanimously Thursday to ban the use of tear gas and to restrict the use of rubber-coated bullets, beanbag rounds, and pepper spray. The vote came after council members heard 2 days of harrowing public testimony about recent police attacks on protesters that left 31 people hospitalized, 2 of them with serious head injuries. Austin City Council also voted Thursday to reinvest some police department funds in other agencies and to limit the use of police deadly force. Thursday's council meeting opened with a moment of silence for 42-year-old Michael Ramos, a Black and Latinx man who was killed by Austin police April 24th after a 911 caller falsely reported he had a gun. Video of Ramos's final moment shows him holding his hands up and shouting that he was unarmed when a rookie officer shot him with a beanbag round. Ramos retreated to his car, tried to drive away, when another officer opened fire with a rifle, hitting Ramos 3 times. He was pronounced dead at a local hospital that evening. The Travis County District Attorney has promised a grand jury investigation. Authorities in Kentucky have revealed a member of the National Guard fired the bullet that killed the owner of a popular barbecue stand in Louisville on June 1st. The state says David McAtee was hit in the chest by a military-grade ammunition fired from an M4 assault rifle used by the Guard. An attorney for McAtee's family said it was absurd that the government is, quote, unleashing your own soldiers on your citizens with weapons of war. Local police also fired at McAtee, who is a beloved figure in the community, who regularly gave police officers free meals. He was African-American. In other news from Louisville, the Metro Council has unanimously passed a bill called Breonna's Law to ban no-knock warrants. The bill's named after Breonna Taylor, the 26-year-old African-American emergency room technician who was shot to death by Louisville police inside her own apartment in March. The officers still have not been charged. In more news from Kentucky, Democratic Governor Andy Beshear has vowed to extend health care coverage to all Black residents in Kentucky. His promise comes as part of a statewide proposal aimed at addressing systemic racism in health care, education, and law enforcement agencies. Here in New York, protests and marches against racism and police brutality continued for a 17th straight day Thursday. In the Bronx, 16-year-old Jamel Leach says New York police officers shot him in the face with a taser, slammed him to the ground at a recent Black Lives Matter protest, leaving him hospitalized with broken teeth and facial lacerations. Leach also says officers forced him to walk around naked at the 52nd precinct. The website The Grio interviewed the teenager by email since his jaw is still wired shut from his injuries. Meanwhile, the National Lawyers Guild says NYPD officers intentionally targeted legal observers for harassment, assault, and arrest at recent protests. Official New York Police Department policy acknowledges the right of legal observers who wear signature fluorescent green hats at demonstrations to monitor police activity and to record the names of those arrested. In Oklahoma City, newly released police body cam footage shows the violent arrest of 42-year-old Derek Scott, who died May 2019 after 3 Oklahoma City police officers pinned him to the ground with their hands and knees for 13 minutes, even after he became non-responsive. The graphic video shows Scott pleading for his life, repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe," to which one of the officers replies, "I don't care."
I can't breathe.
Stop resisting.
I can't breathe, please. Yeah, please.
Okay, give me your hand.
I can't breathe. I got hands full. Oh, I can't breathe. I don't care.
A coroner reported the cause of Scott's death was a collapsed lung. Derek Scott's mother, Vicki Scott, says the release of the video has reopened old wounds.
Just reliving this all over again is like reliving his death all over again. And then watching George Floyd. There's a lot of George Floyds, and my son was one of them.
In Tulsa, Oklahoma, newly released body cam footage shows 2 officers pressing a 13-year-old African-American teenager's face first against a curb and handcuffing him after he allegedly jaywalked in a quiet street with no sidewalk on June 4th.
Why are you arresting him? Why are you putting handcuffs on? Because. Why are you putting handcuffs on my car?
All he was doing was jaywalking. We just want to talk with him.
In the video, the teenager, 13 years old, calls officers racist and says, "You want to see me in jail or dead?" Tulsa police say the incident is, quote, under investigation. The Trump campaign will require attendees at the president's first rally since the start of the coronavirus pandemic to sign liability waivers acknowledging the risks of COVID-19 and promising not to sue if they contract the disease at the event. Trump scheduled the Oklahoma rally on June 19th despite CDC guidelines warning against large events and mass gatherings. The rally will take place on Juneteenth, a celebration of African Americans' liberation from slavery in the city of Tulsa, where 99 years ago, a white mob killed as many as 300 people, overwhelmingly black. California Senator Kamala Harris tweeted in response, "This isn't just a wink to white supremacists. He's throwing them a welcome home party." While calls are growing for cities to defund the police, the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden is calling for an increase in police funding. In an op-ed in USA Today, Biden called for police departments to receive an additional $300 million to, quote, reinvigorate community policing in our country. On Wednesday night, Biden discussed police funding on The Daily Show.
I don't believe police should be defunded, but I think the conditions should be placed upon them where departments are having to take significant reforms relating to we should set up a national use of force standard.
The country's top military official said Thursday he regrets joining President Trump in a photo op on June 1st after National Guard troops and riot police fired tear gas, rubber bullets, flashbangs to disperse peaceful protesters near the White House so President Trump could pose with a Bible in front of St. John's Episcopal Church. General Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, apologized in a pre-recorded commencement speech for the National Defense University.
I should not have been there. My presence in that moment and in that environment created a perception of the military involved in domestic politics. As a commissioned, uniformed officer, it was a mistake that I have learned from.
Video surveillance has been released showing as many as 13 Chicago police officers broke into Congressman Bobby Rush's campaign office on May 31st, his district office. In the video, the officers can be seen making popcorn and coffee and taking naps. Rush criticized the officers for lounging in his office while nearby businesses were being broken into. Congressmember Bobby Rush is a former Black Panther. In immigration news, a newly published Government Accountability Office report says Customs and Border Protection used portions of a $112 million emergency humanitarian fund meant to buy food, medical supplies, and hygiene products for immigrants in their custody to purchase all-terrain vehicles, dirt bikes, boats, dog food, and even riot helmets. The findings come after Congress urged the GAO to examine CBP's books to determine how the agency had spent emergency funds allocated in 2019 after a surge of asylum seekers arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border and after reports of people being held in overcrowded, squalid CBP processing cells. In Lebanon, protesters took to the streets Thursday as anger mounts over Lebanon's catastrophic economic crisis after its currency plummeted to its lowest value on record. From Tripoli to Beirut, people marched through the night denouncing Lebanon's corrupt political elite, blocking major roads and setting buildings on fire, including several banks. Thursday's demonstrations were among the largest and most widespread since a coronavirus lockdown was imposed in March. The Trump administration announced sanctions Thursday against investigators with the International Criminal Court amidst reports the ICC has evidence of rape, torture, and other war crimes committed by American forces in Afghanistan. Hina Shamsi, director of the ACLU's National Security Project, responded, quote, "President Trump is grossly abusing emergency powers to block one of the only avenues left for justice to victims of terrible American human rights violations. He's repeatedly bullied international organizations and is now playing directly into the hands of authoritarian regimes by intimidating judges and prosecutors committed to holding countries accountable for war crimes," she said. And here in New York, Governor Andrew Cuomo Thursday reiterated his support for monuments to Christopher Columbus after protesters in Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Virginia took direct action to tear down or decapitate statues honoring the 15th century Italian mercenary.
The statue has come to represent and signify appreciation for the Italian-American contribution to New York. For that reason, I support it.
Governor Cuomo's remark came as thousands of people signed a petition calling for Manhattan's Columbus Circle to be renamed and its monument removed. It reads in part, quote, "Christopher Columbus was a white colonist who slaughtered thousands of Native Americans on their own soil. Honoring him is honoring those murders," they wrote. Meanwhile, in Birmingham, Alabama, comedian Jermaine Johnson is pleading not guilty to charge of inciting a riot after he urged protesters at a May 31st rally to march on a statue of Charles Lynn, a former officer in the Confederate Navy.
3 blocks over at Lynn Park, we got a Confederate statue sitting in the middle of our city to remind us to stay in your damn place.
Protesters went on to topple the Charles Lynn statue while vandalizing the nearby Confederate Sailors and Soldiers Monument. Birmingham officials later removed the monument's erected fences around downtown parks in order to ban on protests, including nearby Kelly Ingram Park in the Birmingham Civil Rights District. The park is adjacent to the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 4 African-American girls were killed by a white supremacist bomber in September of 1963. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. After break, we'll be joined by Black liberation, civil rights, human rights icon Angela Davis for the hour. Stay with us.
Serei tambor no coração do imbondeiro para transportar até vós num batuque doido, arrepiante e alegre. A nítida sensação das coisas libertas e do ressoar dos passos ainda hesitantes, confusos por bailar lado a lado com a liberdade.
Guide to the Liberation of Africa by Carlos Lamartine. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the nationwide uprising against police brutality and racism continues to roil the nation and the world, bringing down Confederate statues and forcing a reckoning in city halls and on the streets, President Trump defended law enforcement Thursday, dismissing growing calls to defund the police. He spoke at a campaign-style event at a church in Dallas, Texas, announcing a new executive order advising police departments to adopt national standards for use of force. Trump did not invite the top 3 law enforcement officials in Dallas, who are all African American. The move comes after Trump called protesters thugs and threatened to deploy the U.S. military to end, quote, riots and lawlessness. This is Trump speaking Thursday.
They want to get rid of the police forces. They actually want to get rid of it. And that's what they'd do, and that's where they'd go. And you know that because at the top position, there's not going to be much leadership. There's not much leadership left. Instead, we have to go the opposite way. We must invest more energy and resources in police training and recruiting and community engagement. We have to respect our police. We have to take care of our police. They're protecting us. And if they're allowed to do their job, they'll do a great job. And you always have a bad apple no matter where you go. You have bad apples. And there are not too many of them. And I can tell you there are not too many of them in the police department. We all know a lot of members of the police.
Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden is also calling for an increase to police funding. In an op-ed in USA Today, he called for police departments to receive an additional $300 million to, quote, reinvigorate community policing in our country. On Wednesday night, Biden discussed police funding on The Daily Show.
I don't believe peace should be defunded, but I think the conditions should be placed upon them where departments are having to take significant reforms relating to we should set up a national use of force standard.
But many argue reform will not fix the inherently racist system of policing. Since the global protest movement began, Minneapolis has pledged to dismantle its police department. The mayors of Los Angeles and New York City have promised to slash police department budgets, and calls to defund the police are being heard in spaces that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago. Well, for more on this historic moment, we are spending the hour with the legendary activist and scholar Angela Davis, professor emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz. For half a century, Angela Davis has been one of the most influential activists and intellectuals in the United States, an icon of the Black liberation movement. Angela Davis's work around issues of gender, race, class, and prisons has influenced critical thought and social movements across several generations. She's a leading advocate for prison abolition, a position informed by her own experience as a prisoner and a fugitive on the FBI's top 10 wanted list more than 40 years ago. Once caught, she faced the death penalty in California. After being acquitted on all charges, she spent her life fighting to change the criminal justice system. Angela Davis, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us today for the hour.
Thank you very much, Amy. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, do you think this moment is a tipping point, a turning point? You who have been involved in activism for almost half a century, do you see this moment as different, perhaps more different than any period of time you have lived through?
Absolutely. This is an extraordinary moment. I've never experienced anything like the conditions we are currently experiencing. The conjuncture created by the COVID-19 pandemic and the recognition of the systemic racism that has been rendered visible under these conditions because of the disproportionate deaths in Black and Latinx communities. And this is a moment I don't know whether I ever expected to experience. When the protests began, of course, around the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and many others who've lost their lives to racist state violence and vigilante violence, When these protests erupted, I remembered something that I've said many times to encourage activists who often feel that the work that they do is not leading to tangible results. I often ask them to consider the very long trajectory of Black struggles, and what has been most important is the forging of legacies and new arenas of struggle that can be handed down to younger generations. But I've often said, one never knows when conditions may give rise to a conjuncture such as the current one that rapidly shifts popular consciousness and suddenly allows us to move in the direction of radical change. If one does not engage in the ongoing work, when such a moment arises, we cannot take advantage of the opportunities to change. And of course, this moment will pass. The intensity of the current demonstrations cannot be sustained over time, but we will have to be ready to shift gears and address these issues in different arenas, including, of course, the electoral arena.
Angela Davis, you've long been a leader of the critical resistance movement, the abolition movement. And I'm wondering if you can explain the demand as you see it, what you feel needs to be done around defunding the police, and then around prison abolition.
Well, the call to defund the police is, I think, an abolitionist demand. But it reflects only one aspect of the process represented by the demand. Defunding the police is not simply about withdrawing funding for law enforcement and doing nothing else. And it appears as if this is the rather superficial understanding that has caused Biden to move in the direction he's moving in. It's about shifting public funds to new services and new institutions, mental health counselors who can respond to people who are in crisis without arms. It's about shifting funding to education, to housing, to recreation. All of these things help to create security and safety. It's about learning that safety, safeguarded by violence, is not really safety. And I would say that abolition is not primarily a negative strategy. It's not primarily about dismantling, getting rid of, but it's about re-envisioning. It's about building anew. And I would argue that abolition is a feminist strategy, and one sees in these abolitionist demands that are emerging the pivotal influence of feminist theories and practices.
Explain that further.
Well, I want us to see feminism not only as addressing issues of gender, but rather as a methodological approach of understanding the intersectionality of struggles and issues. Abolition feminism counters carceral feminism, which has unfortunately assumed that issues such as violence against women can be effectively addressed by using police force, by using imprisonment as a solution. And of course, we know that Joseph Biden in 1994, who claims that the Violence Against Women Act was such an important moment in his career, the Violence Against Women Act was couched within the 1994 Crime Act, the Clinton Crime Act. And what we're calling for is a process of decriminalization, not recognizing that that threats to safety, threats to security come not primarily from what is defined as crime, but rather from the failure of institutions in our country to address issues of health, issues of violence, education, etc. So abolition is really about rethinking the kind of future we want, the social future, the economic future, the political future. It's about revolution, I would argue.
You write in Freedom is a Constant Struggle, neoliberal ideology drives us to focus on individuals, ourselves, individual victims, individual perpetrators. But how is it possible to solve the massive problem of racist state violence by calling upon individual police officers to bear the burden of that history and to assume that by prosecuting them, by exacting our revenge on them, we would have somehow made progress in eradicating racism? So explain what exactly you're demanding.
Well, neoliberal logic assumes that the fundamental unit of society is the individual, and I would say the abstract individual. According to that logic, Black people can combat racism by pulling themselves up by their own individual bootstraps. That logic recognizes, or fails rather, to recognize that there are institutional barriers that cannot be brought down by individual determination. If a Black person is materially unable to attend the university, the solution is not affirmative action, they argue, but rather the person simply needs to work harder, get good grades, and do what is necessary in order to acquire the funds to pay for tuition. Neoliberal logic deters us from thinking about the simpler solution, which is free education. I'm thinking about the fact that we have been aware of the need for these institutional strategies at least since 1935, and of course before, but I'm choosing 1935 because that was the year when W.E.B. Du Bois published his journal, Black Reconstruction in America. And the question was not what should individual Black people do, but rather how to reorganize and restructure post-slavery society in order to guarantee the incorporation of those who had been formerly enslaved. The society could not remain the same, or should not have remained the same. Neoliberalism resists change at the individual level. It asks the individual to adapt to conditions of capitalism, to conditions of racism.
I wanted to ask you, Angela Davis, about the monuments to racists, colonizers, Confederates that are continuing to fall across the United States and around the world. In St. Paul, Minnesota, Wednesday, activists with the American Indian Movement tied a rope around a statue of Christopher Columbus and pulled it from its pedestal on the state capitol grounds. The AIM members then held a ceremony over the fallen monument. In Massachusetts, officials said they'll remove a Columbus statue from a park in Boston's North End after it was beheaded by protesters early Wednesday morning. In Richmond, Virginia, protesters toppled a statue of Confederate President Jefferson Davis from Monument Avenue Wednesday night. In the nearby city of Portsmouth, protesters used sledgehammers to destroy a monument to Confederate soldiers. One person sustained a serious injury, was hospitalized after a statue fell on his head. In Washington, D.C., House Speaker Nancy Pelosi joined other lawmakers demanding the removal of 11 Confederate statues from the National Statuary Hall in the Capitol. Meanwhile, President Trump said he will not even consider renaming U.S. Army bases named after Confederate military officers. There are 10 such bases, all of them in southern states. Trump tweeted Wednesday, "These monumental and very powerful bases have become part of a great American heritage and a history of winning, victory, and freedom," unquote. Trump's tweet contradicted Defense Secretary Mark Esper and Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair General Mark Milley, who suggested they're open to discussion about renaming the bases. And a Republican committee in the Senate just voted to rename these bases like Benning and Bragg and Hood that are named for Confederate leaders. Meanwhile, in your hometown of Birmingham, Alabama, Angela, comedian Jermaine Johnson's pleading not guilty to charge of inciting a riot after he urged protesters at a May 31st rally to march on a statue of Charles Lynn, a former officer in the Confederate Navy. Did you think you would ever see this? You think about Bree Newsom after the horror at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, who shimmied up that flagpole on the grounds of the South Carolina legislature and took down the Confederate flag, and they put it right on back up. What about what we're seeing today?
Well, of course, Bree Newsom was a wonderful pioneer, and I think it's important to link this trend to the campaign in South Africa, Rhodes Must Fall. And of course, I think this reflects the extent to which we are being called upon to deeply reflect on a role of historical racisms that have brought us to the point where we are today. Racism should have been immediately confronted in the aftermath of the end of slavery. This is what Dr. Du Bois's analysis was all about. Not so much in terms of, well, what are we going to do about these poor people who have been enslaved so many generations, but rather, how can we reorganize our society in order to guarantee the incorporation of previously enslaved people? Now, the attention is being turned towards the symbols of slavery, the symbols of colonialism. And of course, any campaigns against racism in this country have to address in the very first place the conditions of indigenous people. I think it's important that we're seeing these demonstrations, but I think at the same time we have to recognize that we cannot simply get rid of the history. We have to recognize the devastatingly negative role that history has played in charting the trajectory of the United States of America. And so I think that these assaults on statues represent an attempt to begin to think through what we have to do to bring down institutions and re-envision them, reorganize them, create new institutions that can attend to the needs of all people.
And what do you think should be done with statues, for example, to, slaveholding founding fathers like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson?
Well, museums can play an important educational role. And I don't think we should get rid of all of the vestiges of the past, but we need to figure out context within which people can understand the nature of U.S. history and the role that racism and capitalism and heteropatriarchy have played in forging that history.
Can you talk about racism and capitalism? You often write and speak about how they are intimately connected and talk about a world that you envision.
Yeah, racism is integrally linked to capitalism, and I think it's a mistake to assume that we can combat racism by leaving capitalism in place. As Cedric Robinson pointed out in his book, Black Marxism, capitalism is racial capitalism. And, of course, to just say for a moment that Marx pointed out that what he called primitive accumulation capital doesn't just appear from nowhere. The original capital was provided by the labor of slaves. The Industrial Revolution, which pivoted around the production of capital, was enabled by slave labor in the U.S. So I'm convinced that the ultimate eradication of racism is going to require us to move toward a more socialist organization of our economies, of our other institutions. I think we have a long way to go before we can begin to talk about an economic system that is not based on exploitation and on the super exploitation of Black people, Latinx people, and other racialized populations. But I do think that we now have the conceptual means to engage in discussions, popular discussions about capitalism. Occupy gave us new language. The notion of the prison industrial complex requires us to understand the globalization of capitalism. Anti-capitalist consciousness helps us to understand the predicament of immigrants who are barred from the U.S. by the wall that has been created by the current occupant. These conditions have been created by global capitalism. And I think this is a period during which we need to begin that process of popular education, which will allow people to understand the interconnections of racism, heteropatriarchy, capitalism.
Angela, do you think we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in this country?
Well, that might be, one way to begin, but I know we're going to need a lot more than truth and reconciliation. But certainly we need truth. I'm not sure how soon reconciliation is going to emerge. But I think that the whole notion of truth and reconciliation allows us to think differently about the criminal legal system. It allows us to imagine a form of justice that is not based on revenge, a form of justice that is not retributive. So I think that those ideas can help us begin to imagine new ways of structuring our institutions, such as, not structuring the prison, because the whole point is that we have to abolish that institution in order to begin to envision new ways of addressing the conditions that lead to mass incarceration, that lead to such horrendous tragedies as the murder of George Floyd.
We're going to come back to this discussion and also talk about President Trump going to Tulsa on Juneteenth. We're speaking with Angela Davis, the world-renowned abolitionist, author, activist, and professor emerita at University of California, Santa Cruz, author of many books, including Freedom is a Constant Struggle. Stay with us. Shanty Tones by Philistine. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we spend the hour with the legendary activist scholar Angela Davis, professor emerita at University of California, Santa Cruz. President Trump has announced he's holding his first campaign rally since the quarantine since lockdowns across the country since the pandemic. He's holding it in Tulsa, Oklahoma on June 19th, a highly symbolic day. It was June 19th, 1865, that enslaved Africans in Texas first learned they were free, 2 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The day is now celebrated as Juneteenth. California Senator Kamala Harris tweeted in response, "This isn't just a wink to white supremacists. He's throwing them a welcome home party," unquote. Well, Tulsa recently marked the 99th anniversary of one of the deadliest mass killings of African Americans in U.S. history. In 1921, a white mob killed as many as 300 people, most of them black, after a black man was accused of assaulting a white woman. The white mobs destroyed a thriving African American business district known at the time as the Black Wall Street of America. Well, this all comes as a Tulsa police major is coming under fire after denying systemic racism in the police force there and saying African Americans probably should be shot more. Listen carefully. This is Major Travis Yates in an interview with KFAQ.
If a certain group is committing more crimes, more violent crimes, then that number's going to be higher. Well, who in the world in the right mind would think that our shootings should be right along the U.S. Census line? All of their research says we're shooting African Americans about 24% less than we probably ought to be based on the crimes being committed.
We're shooting them less than they probably ought to be? Tulsa's mayor and police chief have both blasted Yates for the comment, but he remains on the force. And on Friday, President Trump will be there. Angela Davis, your thoughts on the significance of the moment, the place?
Well, that's I can't even respond to anything he does anymore. It's just so ridiculous, it is, however, important to recognize that that he represents a sector of the population in this country that wants to return to the past, make America great again, with all of its white supremacy, with all of its misogyny, and I think that. At this moment, we are recognizing that we cannot be held back by such forces as those represented by the current occupant of the White House. I doubt very seriously whether the people who come out to hear him in Tulsa on this historic day, of course. All over the country, people of African descent will be observing Juneteenth as an emancipatory moment in our history. But I think that our role is to start to begin to translate some of the energy and passion into transforming institutions. The process has already begun, and it can't be turned back, at least not by the current occupant of the White House. I'm not suggesting that it's easy to create lasting change, but at least now we can see that it is possible. When someone like Roger Goodell says Black Lives Matter, even though he did not mention Colin Kaepernick, and even though he probably didn't really mean it, what that means is that the NFL recognizes that it has to begin a new process. That there's a further expansion of popular consciousness. And in New York, of course, you need to ask whether you really want to create new jails in the boroughs in the aftermath of closing Rikers, or whether you need new services. I've been thinking about the case of Jussie Smollett, and I'm wondering why in Chicago, given the conditions surrounding the murder of Laquan McDonald, the police department should be thoroughly investigated. And we need to ask, how is it that the public could so easily be rallied to the police narrative of what happened in the case of Jussie Smollett? So there is so much to be done. And I think that the rallies that the current occupant of the White House is holding will fade into, don't even merit footnotes in history.
Angela Davis, I wanted to ask you about another event that's taken place on June 19th. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute is finally going to issue the Fred L. Shuttlesworth Award during a virtual event on Juneteenth. And I wanted to ask you about this because you returned to your hometown of Birmingham, Alabama last February after the Institute had at first rescinded the award due to your support for BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, and your support of Palestinians. After outcry, the Institute reversed its decision. More than 3,000 people gathered to see you talk at an alternative event to honor you, which was hosted by the Birmingham Committee for Truth and Reconciliation. This is a clip of your comments that day.
It became clear to me that this might actually be a teachable moment.
Yes.
That we might seize this moment to reflect on what it means to live on this planet in the 21st century and our responsibilities not only to people in our immediate community, but to people all over the planet.
We were there covering this amazing moment where the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute had rescinded the award to you, the Fred L. Shuttlesworth Award, went through enormous turmoil. The mayor of Birmingham, so many people across the spectrum criticized them for it. But then this process happened, and you are going to be awarded this. Can you talk about the significance of this moment and what you plan to say on Juneteenth, the day that President Trump will be in Tulsa?
Well, thank you for reminding me that these two events are happening on the same day. And of course, that was, I think, the last time I actually saw you in person, Amy, in Birmingham. A lot has happened over the last period, including within the context of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. They have completely reorganized. They have reorganized their board. They have been involved in conversations with the community. Of course, as you know, the mayor of Birmingham was threatening to withdraw funding from the Institute. There was a generalized uprising in the Black community. And, you know, while at first it was a total shock to me that they offered this award to me and then they rescinded it, I'm realizing now that that was an important moment because it encouraged people to think about the meaning of human rights. And why is it that Palestinians could be excluded from the process of working toward human rights? Palestinian activists have long supported Black people's struggle against racism. When I was in jail, solidarity coming from Palestine was a major source of courage for me. In Ferguson, Palestinians were the first to express international solidarity. There has been this very important connection between the two struggles for many decades, so that I'm going to be really happy to receive the award, which now represents a rethinking of the rather backward position that the Institute assumed that Palestinians could be excluded from the circle of those working toward a future of justice, equality, and human rights.
Speaking about what's going on in the West Bank right now and about the whole issue of international solidarity, the global response to the killing of George Floyd, in the occupied West Bank, protesters denounced Floyd's murder and the recent killing of Iyad El-Halak, a 32-year-old Palestinian special needs student who was shot to death by Israeli forces in occupied East Jerusalem. He was reportedly chanting Black Lives Matter and Palestinian Lives Matter when Israeli police gunned him down, claiming he was armed. These links that you're seeing, not only in Palestine and the United States, but around the world, the kind of global response, the tens of thousands of people who marched in Spain, who marched in England, in Berlin, in Munich, all over the world, as this touches a chord and they make demands in their own countries, not only in solidarity with what's happening in the United States. And then I want to ask you about the U.S. election that's coming up in November. Well,
yes, Palestinian activists have long supported Black people's struggle against racism, as I pointed out, and I'm hoping that today's young activists recognize how important Palestinian solidarity has been to the Black cause, and that they recognize that we have a profound responsibility to support Palestinian struggles as well. I think it's also important for us to look in the direction of Brazil, whose current political leader competes with our current political leader in many dangerous ways, I would say. Brazil, if we think we have a problem with racist police violence in the United States of America, look at Brazil. Marielle Franco was assassinated because she was challenging the militarization of the police and the racist violence unleashed there. I think 4,000 people were killed last year alone by the police in Brazil. So I'm saying this because
and, of course, the president of Brazil, a close ally of President Trump. We only have 2 minutes, and I want to get to the election. When I interviewed you in 2016, you said you wouldn't support either main party candidate at the time. What are your thoughts today for 2020?
Well, my position really hasn't changed. I'm not going to actually support either of the major candidates, but I do think we have to participate in the election. And that isn't to say that I won't vote for the Democratic candidate. What I'm saying is that in our electoral system as it exists, neither party represents the future that we need in this country. Both parties remain connected to corporate capitalism. But the election will not so much be about who gets to lead the country to a better future, but rather how we can support ourselves and our own ability to continue to organize and place pressure on those in power. And I don't think there's a question about which candidate would allow that process to unfold. So I think that we're going to have to translate some of the passion that has characterized these demonstrations into work within the electoral arena, recognizing that the electoral arena is not the best place for the expression of radical politics. But if we want to continue this work, we certainly need a person in office who will be more amenable to our mass pressure. And to me, that is the only thing that someone like Joe Biden represents. But we have to persuade people to go out and vote to guarantee that the current occupant of the White House is forever ousted.
Angela Davis, I want to thank you so much for this hour. World-renowned abolitionist, author, activist, professor emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz, author of many books, including Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of Movement. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay safe.